Good afternoon, grade 6. Our lesson today about the part of the flower. As you see, this is the part of the flower. Please focus with me as at the center of the flower we have stigma, style, ovary, and ovules. This part in the center of the flower is represent the female reproductive organ, and this female part is called carpel. So the female reproductive part of the flower is contained of these four parts: stigma, style, ovary, and ovules. And we have eggs inside the ovules. It also belongs for the female part. If you focus with this picture, we'll have symmetrical parts on the each side. These represent the male part, and it contains of anther and filament. And inside the anther there is a pollen grain. So pollen grain inside the anther and the filament, they are represent the female reproductive organ, and this male reproductive organ is called stamen. So the flower has male reproductive organ and female reproductive organ. That part in the center is represent the female reproductive organ, stigma, style, ovary, ovules, and eggs inside the ovules. And the male part, which is called stamen, is contained of anther and filament and pollen grain inside the anther. Some flower has only the male reproductive part, and there is a flower only has the female reproductive part. And there is a flower has both of them, the male reproductive organ and the female reproductive organ, and this type of flower is called perfect flower. Okay, what is the perfect flower? This is the flower has the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part. Okay, if you see in the bottom, we have sepal, and that label in the top, it's petal. So what is the petal and what is the sepal? Petal is the part that's responsible of attracting insects. So how can they do this process? They have very bright colors and pleasant smell. For that reason, they can attract insects very well. So petal has a bright color and pleasant smell, so they attract insects. Later we will see why do we need to attract insects in process of reproduction, and that process is done by a flower. So the sepal in the bottom, its function is joining the part of the flower, or holding or fusing the part of the flower and connected to the stem. Okay? So this is the part of the flower. The male part, anther filament; the female part, stigma, style, ovary, and ovules. The male part is called stamen, and the female part is called the carpel. We have petal and we have sepal. This is the main part of the flower. As I said before, we have flower just contain the female reproductive organ, and other flower only has male reproductive organ. And we have flower that and we have flower that contains both male and female part, and this flower is called perfect flower. Okay. So, how the flower taking place, the reproduction process. Firstly, the pollen grain will transfer from the anther to the stigma. That means transferring from the male part to the female part. And this transferring is taking place either by two ways, either by animals or by wind. Either by animal or by wind. And this process is called pollination. This process is called pollination. So what is the pollination? Pollination is the transferring of pollen grain from the male part to the female part, or it's transferring of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma. This transferring is taking place either by animals, insect for example, or by wind. Okay? So which part that's responsible of producing the pollen grain? It's the anther. The anther producing the pollen grain. It's producing the pollen grain. While the stigma, this part is responsible of collecting the pollen grain. Of collecting the pollen grain. So how the stigma can collect this pollen grain? The stigma surface is covered with sticky materials. These sticky materials, it helps the pollen grain to stick on it. So, the pollen is responsible of producing the pollen grain, while the stigma is the part that's responsible of collecting the pollen grain. Is it clear? So, after the pollen grain transferring from the male part to the female part and pollination taking place. Before we go to the next step, let us to know the type of pollination. So, if we have plant here, let me label it as plant A. If the pollen grain transferring from the flower on plant A from the anther of flower on plant A to the stigma of the flower on other flower but on the same plant. The pollen grain transferring from flower to the stigma of another flower, but they are on the same plant. Or the pollen grain transferring from the pollen from this flower, from the anther, of this flower, to the stigma of the same flower. So definitely this flower, it has to be a perfect flower. That means it has both the male part and the female part. So this type of pollination, that the pollen grain transferring from anther on this flower to the stigma of another flower, but on the same plant, this is called self-pollination. This is called what? Self-pollination. Okay? This is called self-pollination. This is the self-pollination. Is transferring of pollen from the flower to another flower, but on the same plant, or from the flower to the same flower. This is called self-pollination. We have another type of pollination. Let me label this as plant A, and this is plant B. And the pollen transferring from anther of flower A to the stigma of flower on the plant B. So we have two different plants. This type of pollination is called cross-pollination. So what is the cross-pollination? Is transferring of pollen from the flower on plant A to stigma of another flower on plant B. This type of pollination is called cross-pollination. So now we have two different types of pollination, cross-pollination and self-pollination. Okay. This is step 1 in reproduction of flowering plant, pollination. After the pollination taking place, what will happen? After the pollen grain transferring from anther to the stigma, there is a tube growing downwards, and this tube is called pollen tube. This tube is called pollen tube. This pollen tube, it's growing downwards and connecting to the ovary. The tip of this pollen tube will crack and release the pollen inside the ovary. So after pollination taking place, the pollen tube will growing downwards from the stigma to the ovary and transferring the pollen from the stigma to the ovary. After this pollen grain enter inside the ovary, it's found ovules and it's get eggs inside the ovules. So what will happening? The pollen will fusing or joining with the eggs. That means the male part joining with the female part. And this process is called fertilization. And this process is called what? Fertilization. So what is the fertilization? Fertilization is fusing of male reproductive part to the female reproductive part. So we have distinguished very well between the pollination and fertilization. Pollination is just transferring of the pollen from the male part to the female part, while fertilization is fusing or joining between the male reproductive part and female reproductive part. Is it clear? I hope it will be clear for you.